saw.
Oh, was he? Okay.
Yep, he's in.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Good morning, everyone, or whatever the appropriate expression is, wherever you are in the world. It is definitely early morning here on the East Coast in the United States. It's great to have everyone joined, and I think everyone has our agenda. We posted it on our website. You should receive the emails. And as always, we made the appropriate public notices. Imran sends his apologies for today, but Chun-Wei, I believe I saw Chun-Wei join. So Chun-Wei, it's great to have you here. We're running up against the holidays for you. We also want to welcome our public observers, Karen Stothers, Jim Dalkin, our CAG chair, and Yosh Matsumoto from the Japan FSA. So welcome to you. So this is now a two-part meeting, one today, one tomorrow, and today we're doing agenda items 1 and 2. We've asked you to indulge us by extending the time to 3.5 hours. We don't necessarily need to use all the time, but we'll use as much time as required. The first topic today is the framework for activities, and the second topic is in relation to the work plan for the period of 2022 to 2023 and how we will go about consulting on that. To be clear, as it relates to the framework for activities, this has been underway for some time. It's commenced simultaneously with some of our strategy work and work plan work. The goal is to get the board's agreement on the document. Remember, this is a living document as well. This is not a formal due process document, but it is something to help guide our processes, procedures, and criteria to give us more of a framework for figuring out how things progress through our cycle, and to allow external parties to understand how things progress through our cycle too, and it should provide great transparency. Why I say this is not cast in stone, because we will have to likely adapt this over time. So I feel like it is very much a living document. Tomorrow, we will focus on auditor reporting, post-implementation review. The session will include an update for the working group's information gathering activities, and the working group will share with our board what they have heard so far. They really are looking for our input on the key themes identified during the information gathering activities, and would like to hear from you about the proposed way forward for this topic in light of all the other things we have on our agenda. I'll pause here to see if anyone has any comments. Okay, great. So let's get going. We're going to turn to the framework for activities. The combination of Bev and Billy are going to lead us through this. We're going to break it up into 3 sections. If you look at the board paper, it's questions 1 and 2 will be handled separately, and 3 and 4 will be handled jointly. Just a little context again. Remember, in December 2019, as part of our discussion on strategy and work plan, we provided you a draft in progress of the framework for activities as a reference, just to show you what we had in mind as we were approving those 2 documents. The staff has been working hard with our planning committee on developing the framework and filling it out, and are clarifying our process and our prioritization. So our goal again is to approve the document today. By that I mean not to have any real objections for us going forward with it and publishing it on our website. But again, remember, we have a formal due process document already. This does not change our formal due process. It actually provides clarity within the due process. So Vili, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tom, and hello, everyone. So our previous call on January 26 was dominated by Brett. So Bev and I decided that we also need a day for ourselves. So that's why you're going to hear from Bev and Brett, from B and Bev today. So the first topic, like Tom said, is the framework for activities. So we're referring to, there's no slides for this one. So we're just going to talk you through the document and pause. Like Tom said, there will be 3 rounds where we will get your input. So we're looking at agenda item 1 and 1A. I'm mainly going to refer to agenda item 1A, which is the actual framework document. And like Thomas indicated, the last time the board saw this was in December 2019, when we presented a draft together at that stage with the strategy and work plan that was up for approval at the December 2019 meeting, with the idea that we will go away and develop this further. So really, the objective of this framework for activities is to provide a framework for how the IAASB undertakes its work, and that we can incorporate this as part of our internal processes and procedures. As Thomas alluded to as well, this does not affect our due process and working procedures. You would have noticed that at appropriate places within the document, we do refer to the due process and working procedures, but it does not affect the due process and working procedures at all. And really, the need for this document came from the need to be a little bit more structured and a little bit more deliberate in how we organize our activities and how we make decisions about our work streams and projects, and really making sure that we give attention to the right topics at the right time. As Thomas indicated, it's a living document, and it's really about just enhancing also transparency to the outside, but also to create certainty inside in terms of our activities. And you will see that we've done it into we've divided into 4 sections. So we say the work we undertake falls within information gathering and research, or we're busy with revising or developing standards, or we can undertake narrow scope maintenance of standards, or we can undertake activities to support the implementation of the IAASB standards. And I think what we picked up when we were developing the strategy and work plan back in 2019 is that, especially with regard to the first section and the last section, information gathering and research activities, and there's activities to support the implementation of the IAASB standards. During that whole process, we got a lot of questions about what are in these sections, how do we deal with things in these sections, what's the output that comes out of these things. Because I think the middle 2, well, number 3 is new, but still very much standard setting, and number 2 we're obviously all very familiar with. So really, to give it a little bit of structure, be deliberate in how we do it, but also allow flexibility so that we don't get caught up in our own process. So I think with that introduction, what I'm going to do first is I'm going to hand to Bev, that will take us through the information gathering and research activities.
Thank you, Billy, and hello, everyone. So we're looking at section 1, and the objective of this process really is just to have transparency about how we select our new projects. And once selected, we've got a much more, as Billy said, a structured and deliberate way of scoping the work that we're going to be doing. Once the projects are selected, we need to focus our efforts on those areas where we're going to be in info gathering. So we're going to be looking at the work that we need to do going forward. So really focusing on what needs to be fixed within the standards. And this process really just helps us to make the decisions and to allocate our resources to the right places. Obviously, we have a lot of asks of us, but we have limited resources, both in board capacity, so the amount of time that we can spend with the board during the year, and that's reduced in this virtual environment, but also obviously staff resources. So we start with a big pool of topics. So we hear about a lot of things and everybody wants us to do something. That big pool of topics is kept in what we call category A. So what it is effectively is a massive spreadsheet that we have, we keep it by ISA. So anything that we hear about a particular ISA goes into the spreadsheet. So we've got all the issues that have been brought up about all the ISAs going all the way back to the ISA implementation monitoring project. As we do a project on a particular topic, we clear out the spreadsheet for that ISA. So we collect up all the issues. So on some of the newer ones like audit evidence or fraud or going concern, we've been collecting issues that are related to those standards along the way. We sort of pull them out as we start the topics. There is a specific staff assigned to monitoring this spreadsheet. We will do a regular environmental scan to see whether there's anything else that needs to come into the spreadsheet. And we also obviously do, Tom and the board members do lots of outreach. We hear lots of things and they get added in there. Once we've done all of that, we'll continually scan to see if anything's bubbling up within those topics. And as capacity opens up, we'll look at the ones that are bubbling up. We'll then apply the criteria to those topics, and that will help give some transparency as to how we make the decision as to what our next project is. The paper talks about how we came to the criteria. Obviously, we looked at what others have done and what our mandate is, but always public interest will be the overriding criteria for anything that we select. Once we've made decisions about what moves from category A to category B, so you've sort of run through the criteria, there may be discussions as to which project comes next. You're moving to category B, and this is a much more targeted and increased activity focused on a particular topic. But, and again, the paper sets out when the board get involved, the staffing of these topics, but it's really to try and work out that there is actually something there. At some point, and we sort of know it, and I equate it to love. You kind of know it when you need it or when it's there. We'll know when this is going to become a project. We'll assign a task force, and we'll then move into category C. And at that time, it becomes much more regular at the board meetings. So an example of what this has sort of gone through is fraud and going concern. So if you look at those two projects over the last year, fraud and going concern, probably for a large portion of the year, we're in category B. So we were doing focused efforts on them, but it was largely staff, maybe with 1 or 2 board members involved. But as we got towards the end of the year, we realized that we really would have to put efforts towards them. So we set up working groups for those 2 topics. So they've moved into category C. And category C effectively is the scoping of the project. So really trying to get evidence-based decisions on what we do to be able to undertake our work and focus our efforts going forward. So the category C activities really are around scoping projects or deciding on what other actions the board needs to take. And then once you obviously move past category C, then you move into sections 2, 3, and 4. So we'll make a decision on, is it a narrow scope amendment? Is it standard setting, or is it rather some kind of non-authoritative guidance? It's a linear process. It's written like that. It's a little bit like the standards, but it doesn't necessarily need to be. You may, if there's something really urgent comes up, you can sort of do A, B, and C all at the same time. So we can move quite quickly through. What we don't want is to get caught up in our own process in this. We want to give transparency. We want to have a bit of structure around it, but we don't want it to be too onerous of a process that we get caught up about whether you're in category B or C. So there may be situations where we move really quickly through. And I'll use an example of that is some of the IAASB work sometimes that happens is that it comes in as a little bit of a surprise to us. We then have to move really quickly into a project. So we sort of move through these categories very quickly. So it's really just to maintain a balance with the transparency about how our decisions are made and the work that we're going to do, and really focusing in on the work. So we're trying to make sure that when we do projects, they're properly scoped, they're deliberately scoped, so that the work that we do really focuses on what needs to be done. So I think that in the paper, there's lots of information about as I said, who's involved, the people, the types of activities within each of the categories. So I'm not going to say very much more on the framework. So Tom, with that, I'm going to hand back to you to get any comments we have on this part of the framework. Thank you.
We're talking about the information gathering activities. Information gathering and research activity section, and this is been talked about to some extent in other settings, but this is the first time this board gathered is really seen it as part of the whole document. Any thoughts? So.
Thanks, Tom. Happy to kick off. I support the concept of the framework. I think it's important that we have that kind of structure and thought process that underlines it. I was very reassured by the comments both Billy and Bev made about this being a living document and flexibility, because I think it is important that while there is an element of structure there, it's not so complex that it actually slows down the process on certain things. A few specific points on this section was just to encourage the outreach with people like SMPs and reflecting the SME community, which is harder to get to, I know, than some of the sources that are mentioned. There's a reference in there to an annual review. To me, that seemed as though it should probably be the minimum. If you think about what's happened in the last year with COVID and so on, that would have been too infrequent. So I would encourage reflection on that. And then perhaps just picking up on something Bev said about resources, both at board and staff level. There's a section in the category B piece around the feasibility of doing something, and I actually felt that if the issue meets the public interest criteria, some of the other criteria, then the resourcing needs to follow that and reflect that. And so I was a little bit wary about having that as a criteria in itself, because I think we should be flexing the agenda if there are things that are higher up the priority list than maybe things that are in process. So those are my comments. Thanks.
Okay, Sue, thank you for that, Sue. I think one of the things on your last point, though, one of the things we need to keep in mind, there may be these quick wins that you're able to do because of some resource availability that it would be in public interest to do, but not other things. So if you have two things that are sort of competing, one may be slightly lower, but you have the resources available, you may at that particular moment be able to jump in and take that project up. Sachika.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Billy and Bev, for your explanation. I also very much support the framework. I think it's very important. And I have 3 comments, and one comment, for the first comment is actually related to the framework as a whole. Reading through Agenda 1, perhaps it's just only to me and it's my bad understanding, but it's not clear to me whether the framework and the process of the assessment in accordance with the framework will be published or not, because in Agenda 1, it explained that the framework is intended to be an internal document, but I think that the framework itself and the relevant decision in accordance with the framework, such as movement of the specific topic from category A to B, should be made transparent, because I think that one of the aim of developing the framework is to make our information gathering process more transparent. And from Billy and Bev's explanation, I am now understanding that perhaps the intention is to make them transparent, considering the balance of flexibility. But I just would like to confirm whether it is the case. And my second comment is on criteria for inclusion in category A. I think this criteria is very broad, and perhaps it makes a little bit unclear what the distinction is between the criteria for category A and the criteria for category B, because the criteria for category A include public interest and relates to the IAASB's international standards. But in the criteria for B, again, there is public interest needs and topic is within the broad remit, and they are very similar. I know that the criteria for category should be intended to be very broad, but for category A, perhaps maybe we do not need to call it as criteria, but we can just say something like possible topics that may fall into the IAASB's remit that are globally relevant and that may warrant further focused information gathering and research, considering public interest, are included in category A. Then we can use the criteria for category B to filter the project to progress category B. And my last comment is on criteria for inclusion in category B. It's just a matter of ordering, but I wonder perhaps it would be easier to understand if we move topic is within the board limit up after there is public interest need. Because I think there is public interest need is most important criteria. And perhaps the second most important is topic is within the board limit. And feasibility is, I think, the third most important. And I think the remaining criteria all somewhat relates to there is a public interest need. So I think it would be easier to understand if we move topic within the board limit up before feasibility to make it second. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you. On the first topic, I think that I'll let the substantive comments come in. I think we may have caused some confusion by calling it internal, but the intent is to publish this on our website. Internal, what we mean is that it's not our due process document, that it's really meant to guide our thinking and what we would publish externally to provide transparency to others to understand how we were progressing topics through our pipeline. That's right, Bev, really, right? Okay. Diane.
Thanks, Tom. Hello, everybody. First of all, again, very supportive of this structure. I think, as you indicated, Bev, a lot of topics, not a ton of resources. So helping everybody with some guidelines in terms of projects is very important. A couple thoughts. To me, the movement from category A to category B seems to be a really key movement, right? And you did a nice job of outlining on page 6 the various criteria. A thought might be an impact analysis, and I don't want to describe that as something that's overly cumbersome and difficult, but some sort of impact analysis that helps you say this topic has a high impact, and then you also talk about degree of difficulty, and you map out your 4 quadrants, and maybe you decide to focus on high impact. I know it's going to be difficult, but this is a really important subject, like the fraud going concern. By doing an impact analysis, you might also be able to identify some quick hits, and Tom alluded to this. I think when you have a lot of projects, if you can find some quick hits, you can get them done. There's a feeling of accomplishment. There's some psychological benefit to being able to say, hey, I got a couple things done in bite-sized chunks that, by the way, also had a high impact. So just think about that, because I do think that movement from A to B appears to me to be a really critical movement. And I think just having a tiny bit more structure around that would be helpful. This category A, I like the comments that Sachiko made regarding, maybe just calling it more topics, because it does seem that it's a topic listing. I agree with Sue that there should be an annual review, if not sooner. And one of the things that wasn't clear to me is, does anything ever come off category A? Or is it this constant growing list, which again, I just question whether at some point something should come off, and what are the protocols to decide if something is indeed going to come off. And then I believe Sue mentioned this also, was just the concept of making sure that when we're in category A and we're gathering up these possible topics, we're reaching out to people with specialized skills, specialized topics, so that we make sure that we really have that holistic list. Again, you want to do some work. I know that the downside of that is you will end up with a lot of topics in category A, but I do think making sure that we're being thoughtful in who we're reaching out to on what topics, and recognizing when maybe we need some specialized assistance would be key. And that was it for me. Thank you.
Thank you. Roger?
Yeah, thanks. Look, I think this is very good work and progressed very well. So the overall comment is, I think this is in very good shape. Very much in agreement with Sachiko and Diane. I And thanks, Tom, for clarifying that this list will be public. I did hear the word transparent repeated many times, so I think that's very beneficial. I do think there is some criteria to get onto the list for Category A, so high-level criteria, but the more we can distinguish between Category A and Category B, the better. I understand that it's going to be a very large spreadsheet, etc., a bit of a wish list, and we'll have many people hopefully contributing to it and adding it to it. So we need to have some ideas as to what will be going in or why we would leave things out. I agree very much that the major issue is the move from Category A to Category B. I do think we've got the criteria pretty well right for there. I like the impact analysis. The issue we're going to have to justify is still why did we, and we'll be able to justify anything that basically moves from A to B that meets those criteria. But because of the resources, it's going to be, why did you choose one topic over another? So what was the ranking that was there? So there's going to have to be some sort of a transparency or justification over that. But we don't want to get too much into justifying those decisions. So, but I do think that people will be looking to see why their pet topic didn't get moved over the ones that did get moved. So that's just something we'll have to be very careful about on having a transparent process going forward. I do like the idea of, making sure that this is under continuous review as well. But again, I just think that this is in excellent shape, and thanks again for the clarifications that both this will be public and that the Category A list will be public.
Josephine.
Thanks, Tom. Morning all. Echo comments that Bev and Willie, thank you for the introduction, and I agree with Roger. I think this is an excellent shape. I mean, we've been following this for a while now, and I think you've got to a really, really great spot now. So thank you for that. Just a couple of more detailed comments, if you like. On page 3, we talk about the fact that the topics necessarily flow in a linear manner. You mentioned that, but a topic may start in Category B. Found that slightly confusing, and even more so from the conversations this morning about understanding the flow between the two. I think the point that you made, Bev, in your introduction, that actually a topic will still go through all these processes A to C, but the activity within that will vary according to the topic. So I think just to keep it less complex and try and then justify what might just suddenly drop into B and not go through the A process might be a better way to address that, the fact that you'll have less work around certain topics than others. I also agreed. I also thought for sources of Category A topics, unless it's already implicit in the list that's already there, I think we ought to add work of another standard setting body. So the IAASB, for example, even IASB, where it has a direct impact on our own standards, particularly where it's conforming amendments, that's maybe easier to deal with, but something in that area. And I wasn't sure that that was necessarily clear in that list. Similar to Sue, I do think, notwithstanding Tom's points on this, I do think that feasibility point is somewhat misleading. It does imply that when you've ticked all the boxes there and you have all of those and you're very comfortable that there is something that needs to be done here, because of the capacity of the board, it's just going to be dropped. And that's not what we mean. It's about balancing the board time and making sure we have the right priorities. So I'm not sure that exists as a category in and of itself. I think your resources generally, which you allude to later in one of the paragraphs on timing, I think that just sits over all of the categories. Again, these are really minor points. And then just on outputs, we talk about revising, developing standards, development, non-authoritative and so forth. And then we have other activities, which is specific outreach activities. And I wasn't quite sure where that fits. I think there would be specific outreach activities in the 3 bullets above, but I'm not sure what else you'd be doing by the time you got to that point. So if there is something that you're thinking of, maybe just bring that to life a little bit for me. And that's all I had. Again, just great work. Thank you.
Thank you, Josephine. Fernanda?
Thanks, Tom. Hello, everyone. A lot of good comments from the other board members, so I will not repeat them, but I want to support as well the document. Having read a previous version, I think this one flows much better, easier to understand, especially the section and how items move in different categories. I think it's important to make it available because national standard setters can plan also for timing, resources, and have a better picture of what is coming over the next couple of years. And that will also help to integrate the work plan with any other local projects. The only piece that I struggle, and it's a comment from Sue and Josephine, the feasibility of resources, it seems really to discourage that items will move from A to B, and I don't think that's the message. That could be a little bit misleading for someone just reading the document in a cold way. But besides that, great job. Thank you.
Thank you, Fernando. Next, we have Ada.
Yes, thank you, Tom. Indeed, and as said by many others, I'm also positive to create the framework. This will provide more insight into the flow of how the board prioritizes the topics that it takes under its wing, and line of sight on how that ends up in any type of output. I had a similar point as Josephine, that that this also provides an opportunity to demonstrate that we're aligned, or at least aware of the opportunity of the activities, for example, of IAASB or IAASB, and that we mirror those topics also in our categories. I like the impact matrix that Diane mentioned, but I'm still not entirely sure that I feel the distinction between A, B, and C. I understand A is a long list, but I also feel, and particularly because of the resourcing element being brought into B, which I struggle to envisage how that will be the sort of the medium list. So I was thinking of a long list, medium list, short list, and that a impact assessment would probably be better after the medium list, where also some potential reprioritization of resources may occur. So that's where I was struggling a little bit. I was also thinking about the disruptive technology session and the activity that was entertained, and rightly so. But where would that then sit? Would that be in A at the moment, or was it already in B because resources were allocated to it? That's just a question that I had, and that I think, yeah, sums up my comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Eric.
Thanks, Tom. I just wanted to show my support for this document. I think like others, it's the right thing to do, and it's a lot of thought has been put into it, and very supportive. Most, if not most, of my comments have already been mentioned by others, so I won't repeat them. The only thing I would suggest is, I'm just trying to find it in page 3 of the document, where it talks about different activities, you know, around fact finding and targeted information gathering and so on. I found that there was a significant amount of overlap of kind of the purpose of those different activities. And so I wasn't sure whether it was really necessary to distinguish the purpose of the different activities that might be undertaken. So you know, my suggestion would be, what are the what are the sort of basic activities that we might undertake, and then what are the different purposes that those activities might be for. But that's a very minor point. I think everything else looks really good. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to pause now because first of all, I think in general, the comments have been very supportive, but there are a few clarifying points that I think we could get in right now and a couple of themes. And then that may help our 5 remaining commentators. I'm not meaning to preempt your comments, but if clarifications can help you with your comments, I think it's a good point. Billy and Bev, I'll turn to you to jump in here.
If you can go ahead.
Okay, thanks. And thanks for all the good comments. I'm not going to cover everything, just a couple of things. The one is, I think Diane asked how we clear it out. It will get cleared out over time. So as we do projects, obviously that clears out the category A, but also there'll be some topics that are very old. So you do get to a point where, so I think that sort of that annual review was intended to just kind of look what's in there and do we really still need it, particularly the old stuff. I mean, we've got things sitting there now from us implementation monitoring, but those are sitting there for standards that haven't been revised and they may still be relevant. But again, we would still need to do some work to make sure that they are still relevant if that sort of topic bubbles up. I think the biggest thing that I'm hearing really is the distinction between A, B, and C. I think the intention is within A, and Ido described it as a long list, a medium list, and a short list. I think that all to me happens in A, and we'll need to just clarify some of this. There will be judgment involved. So we'll have to keep an eye and an ear out for those topics that are kind of bubbling up. And those are the ones that kind of move to the medium list. Then we'll need to do a little bit of work around them and maybe run them just sort of a preliminary look at the criteria to see what could move to B. Because by the time you get to B, those are the topics where there's focused energy on it. So a lot of that sort of happens in the category A, and we probably need to just have a look at how we've described that sort of as you move through. So by the time you put properly through the criteria, you're coming out with maybe 2 or 3 topics, and it's at that point that we'll then need to decide on how the resources get allocated to that. There's also a balance between, we can't just do everything. So even if things are bubbling up, then at that point, if we really need to do something, we will need to then look at what we've got on our agenda, and decisions will need to be made. We may need to slow projects down. We may need to stop something if something's going to come onto the agenda. We do very careful planning, and it changes after every board meeting about sort of the future flow of the project. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about the work plan later. But we've obviously only got X amount of time with the board, and we need to make sure that we use that time properly. So we can bring other topics onto the board agenda, but we can't make time. So we've then got to make decisions about how we fit it all into the board's agenda. Obviously, at the moment, it's very difficult because we have much shorter board time as we're in this virtual environment. It's a lot more difficult to move a lot. But obviously, as we open up to more face-to-face meetings, then that may ease up a little bit as well. The staff resources side is a little bit easier to manage. We can always do things in the background, and we can always get others to help. So, and we've done that, and that's been evidenced in the past. So it's not so much a staff resources side. It's probably more of a board capacity time. But it's not to say that if something is coming up and is becoming really important that we can't do something. So forward and going concern, again, we're really good examples of this, where they were not on our sort of forward plan at all. And sort of towards the end of 2019, beginning of 2020, they really were bubbling up, and we realized we had to do something. So we've had to maneuver the agenda to kind of take hold of them. To be honest, I would have thought 330 would have been the next project before those two, but because they became much more important public interest topics, they sort of moved up. And we didn't have the criteria at that point, so we wouldn't have put them through the criteria, but had we done it, we probably would have chosen Ford and going concern over 330 for the same reason. But I think what we need to do is maybe just have some more in this document around that category A and how you sort of move to the top of category A so that you can go into category B. But there will be decisions made. The other thing, and we'll talk about it in the work plan, just on how you rank the projects, because I think that also becomes important. So if we've got 3 projects that are really important, they all meet the criteria, which one do we choose? We are going to, in part of the sort of work plan survey that we want to do, we're going to ask our stakeholders to rank, and that obviously will help us as well to understand what they're looking for, because again, we have to allocate our resources. I think the move from B to C is a little bit clearer for most people, but sort of that what happens in category A and the move from A to B, we will have a look at it in this document and maybe make some refinements to make it a little bit clearer. Again, we're working through this process. It's new for us too. So because it's a living document, we'll put things in this document. If it's not working, we can change it. So this is sort of our best effort in what we think at the moment. Category A is new for us. The spreadsheet is there, probably not paying too much attention to it in the past, but it will become a much more integral part of this process, and we'll put some attention to it. So it's sort of developing as we go along. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you. Vili, do you have anything you want to add?
Sorry, I'm just skipping between screens here. Maybe just a few things. The annual review, I think, came up a few times. You're quite right, that is a minimum. I think we've got a footnote in there that says that you know, we will always endeavor to be responsive to specific circumstances as well. I think the comment about the ordering of the criteria in category B made sense, to just remove the remit up together with public interest. I think that will work. On the impact analysis, I understand what we're saying, and I probably think from our perspective, what we thought is that the impact analysis is almost encapsulated within the criteria, because it's considering those criteria individually and in combination. And that is sort of where you're going to have a type of impact analysis. The impact analysis obviously also comes through once something moves into category C, and you're really busy with detailed analysis, trying to get to recommendations, and even if possible, getting to a project proposal. So there was a few comments about the distinction also between A, B, and C. The way that I always think about this is that for me, there are 3 key words that describe each of these categories. So category A is explore, monitor, post-implementation review. That's our pot. Bev also always calls it a pot of all topics. That's everything we know about. B is once things move through that filter, these are a few things that needs more focused information gathering to understand the issues, the challenges, the global relevance. So for me, the 3 key words about category B is more focused information gathering, understanding the issues, challenges and root causes, global relevance. We're starting to dissect the topic. And then from there, we can either decide we can either decide we stop because there's not enough there, or it goes into C, where we set up a working group, and then it is about analysis, recommendations, project proposal. So also that notion of a long list, medium list, short list, we need to be careful. Everything is in the pot. Once it bubbles up and we take it out of the pot and it goes into B, from there it will naturally progress B to C. If we find that there's enough there from the focused information gathering to establish a working group, so we can get to a point of recommendations and, if then applicable, project proposal. So I've either now clarified it, Tom, or everybody is now confused.
Okay, well, we've gotten some context. We have 5 more hands. First, Yosh.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you very much for planning committee for understandable papers, it's very readable for us. So generally, I'm supporting this to finalize this the framework. I'm sure to the planning committee might have considering this. I want to confirm that as others already mentioned about the publicity, I think it might be necessary to conduct a consultation on this framework itself, because it's very extremely important for developing the standards, auditing standards. The second one and third one is about the governmental issue. Issues paper paragraph 20 mentions governance reforms by monitoring group. And I would like any information on how the PIOB is involved in this framework to enhance due process oversight. The third one is, I think there needs to be a description about the relationship between this framework and the CAG in the IAASB due process at the stage of moving from category B to C. That's it. Thank you.
Okay. Chun Wei?
Thank you, Tom. Can everyone hear me? Yeah, sorry. I had some issue with my laptop, so I'm logging in on my mobile as well. So I almost wanted to put down my hand after hearing all the conversation because all my doubts have been cleared. But I'll just come in very quickly to support the framework. I think it's a really helpful document. And given the clarification that this will be made publicly available. So I think there are some, in terms of the presentation, the pictorial representation of the whole process, I myself was a little bit caught up with it and I felt slightly confused by it. So I have some recommendation which I'll send through to Bev and Willie for your consideration. But just to come very quickly to the criteria, which is from A to B. Again, my question have been responded to, but just want to say that another way to ask this is, is this meant to be a one strike and you're out kind of decision tree or more holistic consideration? Clearly, it's a holistic consideration, and I think that therein, the weightage given to each the points like, is it within remit? I think within remit is one strike or out. If it's not within remit, it wouldn't be in at all. And feasibility, which many of our colleagues have raised, I do think that having it as it is right now presented, it will cause some confusion. So I think we probably need to fix it. Just one last point on the public interest need. To my mind, it will be very challenging to say that a specific topic does not meet a public interest need. If it does not, it probably wouldn't be in consideration at all. It's probably a degree of, as well as, it's different component of public that will be affected. So maybe it's a little bit of what Diane said in terms of impact analysis. I do think that that public interest need may need to be expanded a little bit so that, we can more clearly communicate to the outside world, how we make all this decision. But generally very supportive. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you, Chun-Wei. Kai Morton.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Willie and Bev, for the presentation and the clarifications that have been made throughout the discussion so far. I don't have too many points. I think most of it has been brought up already. I really support the framework of activities. I think it's really important that we get something out to explain how we go about deciding which items that come on our agenda. I think the discussion we're having now is also supporting that the document is in a really good shape, because we're really discussing super detailed items in the document, which brings me to my next point. As we said, this is not, as I think in the introduction we said, we can't be caught in process. This is not our due process. It's just explaining how we go about it. So are we creating something too detailed, which may haunt us at the end, that we will be caught somewhere in this process trying to explain why we move in a different direction? Because there are a level of judgment, high level of judgments included when you go from one area to the other. So by having too many detailed factors and visibility on all the details, as long as this doesn't slow the process down, I think it's a good thing. And I think also that having the open and transparent view will help getting input to IAASB on the items that we have on the list, so that other people may comment on what's more important or less. So that's I think it's a good thing. So as I said, supportive of the document. It's a living document, but don't get caught in trying to describe everything in too much detail, because there are judgment involved and it will be difficult to cover it off completely in a document like this. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll stick with Kai's. Anyway.
Thanks, Tom, and also hello, everyone. It's good to have this discussion. It's good to have this framework. I support the framework as a whole. I have only one aspect which I want to mention. In my view, the categorization of how close an issue is to becoming a project on the agenda from A to C is too counterintuitive. In my view, it might be better to have the project move up to the agenda from C to A. Otherwise, in my view, the proposals for the information gathering and research activities section appear sensible. So thanks, Bev, and thanks, Willie, for the paper.
Thank you. Josephine?
Thanks, Tom. Sorry to jump back in. I was going to make this point at the end. I don't know where it fit really, but Ado did mention the point about technology. Willie, Bev, I was wondering how you see the interaction or overlap of the two working groups, the professional skepticism and the technology working group, fitting alongside our framework here. So, for example, you might have something scanning the environment that is actually a technology topic or would fall into the technology criteria, as it were. And then you'll go through, is it then, well, we've already got this working group, we'll have them go through that process. Okay, so you're nodding. So just maybe just getting some clarity around that. Thank you.
Okay, this is concluded the hands raised part. Let me deal with a couple of issues sort of that have more governance before I turn it back to Bev. You talked about consultation on a couple of levels. Personally, I'm very reluctant to do any public consultation on this document, partly because this is the way we work internally and think our thought process. It's not our formal due process, which obviously we would have some consultation on. We're almost being extra transparent. This almost goes to Kai's counterpoint. Like, there is a risk that we get tied up in process, and we've sort of just tried to take the right balance here, and just try to sort of give a, I guess if you take the metaphors, like we've opened up the hood on a car so people could see what's happening inside of our group where we haven't shown it before, and also given us some more structure in our thought process. This doesn't stop us from speaking to the CAG at key junctures, which we clearly will do, and that's part of our CAG operating procedures and our due process as well. That all stay in place and will be part of our monitoring group reforms for whatever advisory group succeeds the CAG, if that's the direction that people decide to go. The PIOB, we've been sort of talking informally with the PIOB. PIOB observes this process as well. Obviously, if we had a due process change, formal due process change, we would consult with the PIOB too on that. So that's sort of to be on the governance. Kai Morton, on your point, is I get it. I think it's just sort of cost benefit of being more transparent in the way we go, but then again, not being particularly legalistic about it. Like, we don't want to borrow an expression that we hear often in this standard setting world, let the form defeat substance in this discussion. And certainly the public interest demands us to move in a rapid pace. And, we may, as long as we don't violate a formal due process, we may at times live more by principle here than by the whole detail of every rule. So I hope that's responsive to both your points. Bev and Vili, there were a couple more points about a refinement of the document as well. So I turn it back to you.
Yeah, nothing that I'll go through. I think some very, very helpful points, though. A couple of things for us to think about. I think we need to have a relook at the criteria just to make sure that they're a little bit clearer. And then obviously thinking about how, and if we build in an impact analysis, and then some other useful sort of comments around just to clarify. And Josephine, to your point, we probably do need to think a little bit more around how we build in the interaction with those ongoing working groups like professional skepticism and technology, so that's clear. And then also maybe just build a little bit more into this document around who we're actually talking to. So the one thing that hasn't really come up, I think it's in the document, is the NSS. Obviously, they're a huge feeder into this process, but then adding in the IAASB, the IAASB, the other standard setters, etc. So we will just have a look at those to make sure that they're very clear as to where this information is coming from. I think a lot of the clarity really comes around that category A and how you sort of get to the top of category A. So we'll have a good look at that. So thank you very much for all the comments today. They were very helpful.
Yeah, and it sort of clarified to me that we will clearly have to do some refinement of this document, but I think what we'll seek is approval from the board subject to planning committee review of the refinements to say it's consistent with the board discussion. I hope we'll get to that ultimately, but that's sort of the proposition that I have in mind as we get to conclusion. Vili, one last there, Bev. There's some questions about what's being published and what's not being published. It would be great if you guys could clarify it for the board.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. So just on that point, I think clearly the intention is that based on today's discussion, we will finalize the document. And then the intention is to publish the framework on the website together with the work plan. I think that's where it belongs. So in that respect, it will definitely, the intention was to make it public. Like we said, we wanted to also, apart from for ourselves, having more certainty, be a little bit more structured and deliberate in how we undertake our work, we also wanted to give transparency to that. So that is clearly the case. I do think at one stage during the discussion, I think it was Roger, I just want to clarify that we're not actually going to publish the category A spreadsheet. That for us is an internal document. Where it will be discussed in public forum would be when we have that annual touch point with the board, or more regularly, depending on the need, but at least an annual touch point with the board. And obviously where there will also be insight into what is in that category A pot is when we consult on our strategy and work plan. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Okay. Should we go on to question 2? We probably have to be conscious of time, but I think question 2 probably will take less time than question 1.
Yes, so Tom, thank you. So, and I just wanted to echo Bev's comment as well. Thank you very much. Those were all very good points. And maybe before we get into sections 2 and 3, there's clearly a process of just refining a few things. And I think then we can take that back to the planning committee, but we can maybe just get the board's input on that at the end when we finish with all 4 of the sections. So for the next one, I'm going to take sections 2 and 3 together, because sections 2 and 3 both really relate to our standards, to our normal standard setting activities that we are all very familiar with. So, and you will also see those are actually presented in just 2 pages within the framework document. So just quickly at the high level, section 2 deals with revising and developing our standards. And you will see that the starting point for section 2 is now there's a project proposal. So something went through the section 1, we ended up with a project proposal, and based on that project proposal, we're now undertaking a project to revise or develop a standard. Obviously, this is fully subject to our normal due process and working procedures. The responsibility for action is we will then normally appoint a task force that will undertake the work with support of staff, and the output would be a final, would be a new or revised standard. And we've also put in there some detail around the anticipated timing, depending on whether it's a bigger project or a smaller project. So that was section 2. Section 3 is new. So section 3 is narrow scope maintenance of standards. So let me discuss it, because to an extent we've had this already, but you will see as I go through. So really, with the narrow scope maintenance of standards, we wanted to create a mechanism to say that if there is a need to make a limited number of targeted changes to one or more standards, without the need to have a full scope revision of a standard, then this mechanism can serve that purpose. So it's still standard setting, it's still changing a standard, and that's why it will still go through our normal due process and working procedures. So we anticipate that there may be matters that come up where it is clear that a standard setting response is required, but it does not require a full scope revision of a standard. We don't have to go in and open the standard up completely and revise it from scope, context, objectives all the way through. We can go in and address the need by a narrow scope amendment. There may also be instances where something is a matter of urgency, where something comes up, it is quite urgent. We see that we can actually address it without opening up the full standard. And then again, this mechanism will give us the ability to go in and make those targeted or specific changes to one or more standards. Just to be clear again, this would also require a project proposal, and it will also require the full due process and working procedures to be followed. You would have noticed that there's another component in here where we say that this mechanism can also be used for conforming and consequential amendments that are not related or linked to an active IAASB project. So a good example will be if something in the ethics code happens and we need to make conforming or consequential amendments within our standards. It's not linked to any ongoing project that we have, but this would then be the same mechanism that can be used. Responsibility for action. You can see there that this may also require a task force, or it may not require a task force, and a decision needs to be made about whether a task force is needed by the technical director and the IAASB chair or deputy chair in consultation with the planning committee whether a task force would be needed. And then obviously the timing around this is then much shorter. We anticipate that these types of projects can happen within 12 to 18 months. Last thing that I wanted to say about Section 3, in the process of developing this, the planning committee last year at one stage also considered the possibility of interpretations. And we looked at how other SSBs deal with interpretations. We looked at a few auditing and assurance standard setters around the world, but we specifically looked at the Accounting Standards Board's process for interpretations. And after deliberation and consideration, and we've said this out in the issues paper, the planning committee was satisfied that this mechanism of interpretations would probably not be appropriate for the IAASB standards. In the first instance, we think that the ultimate outcome, if we look at an ultimate outcome, that interpretations, especially in the case of the IASB process, is that you actually make authoritative amendments. We feel that the narrow scope mechanism that we've created can serve that. In any case, we get to the same point. An alternative would be to say, well, is there scope for anything in between non-authoritative material and authoritative material? I think we refer to it in the paper as a sort of a comply or explain approach when you issue an interpretation. We just felt that that's going to introduce a level of complexity that we really don't need. At the moment, we think our distinction is very clear. We've got authoritative pronouncements and we've got non-authoritative material. And that's what we have in our toolbox, and that's how we deal with it. If we need a standard setting, If we need a standard setting solution to something, we either do a full scope standard setting project that is contemplated in section 2, or we do a narrow scope maintenance of a standard or standards that is contemplated in section 3. So for the time being, we've decided not to pursue the possibility of interpretations. But like we said, it's a living document. We're going into a process of monitoring group reforms and implementation of monitoring group recommendations. So we never know, we might at some time in the future have to revisit this. But we thought that at the moment where we are, this is probably the right decision. So Tom, I think I'll pause there so we can take comments on question 2 in agenda item 1, which really just asks for the board's views on sections 2 and 3. There's really the 2 standard setting sections.
Okay. Edo.
Yes, thank you, Tom. Well, I personally like the narrow scope maintenance. I think this will help us act a little bit more agile. There is, I guess, a question in the back of my mind in what are the criteria and the distinction between a revision and a narrow scope maintenance, but I guess that I am comfortable with also a narrow scope maintenance going through a project proposal where this rationale will be outlined and will be up for board consideration. So I'm happy with this. Thank you.
Roger.
Yeah, very supportive of the narrow scope amendments. I think in a framework for activities, it gives us another approach to these types of areas. We haven't needed it in the past, Billy, so it'll be interesting to see the areas where we do need it, and it will bring a new discipline to the board, very much emphasising what's in the project proposal and sticking to that particular project proposal, but very supportive of it being there. And happy at the moment that we stick away from an interpretations type of approach. We are different from the IAASB. We very much a process driven as distinct from a accounting subject matter issue type area. And if we haven't got something right, then we should go back and fix it up. So as distinct from interpreting it. So I'm very comfortable with where you are at the moment.
Yeah, Roger, just to your point that we could envision more utility in this approach too, as we do post-implementation reviews on our recently approved standards, that they may, hopefully they don't have unintended consequences, but maybe they will, and having this tool in our toolbox will certainly help. Wendy.
Thanks, Tom. I'm thinking it's the time for me to make a comment that sort of threads into the earlier discussion, and that is about transparency and communication. You know, I'm really impressed with this paper and the framework and the level of detail. I am concerned with the word published, and I'm very visual, so I'm thinking about when publishing, we need some sort of virtual visual aids that go with it to make our points very clear about public interest, how we funnel what we're doing from category A to B. I'm actually thinking about a funnel when I say it, and just shorten some of the communication so we get our messages out very quickly. And then in this, tying into this particular question, I fully support the narrow scope. I don't think we need another layer. I think when we start putting out interpretations, it's very confusing to the user group. And that's really my second point. It's the user group, not us, who really needs to understand this, although we are talking about it. It's those that use the materials that we publish, and they need to be understandable to them. So I'm focused on, I'm fully support the paper and the conclusions that were made here, but I'm focused on the method of communication that supports the transparency. Thank you.
Thank you. Sue.
Thank you. So also support this. I think it's very good. It'll demand a degree of discipline on keeping in the scope. My only observation really was around the potentially still quite a long timeline to get through to a narrow scope amendment, and given the feedback we've had about speed of turnaround, how that we just need to probably explain the processes and how we're dealing with the feedback from and making sure that we're following due process to update it. So just that kind of speed of turnaround, might we be able to do things quicker as well? Thanks, Tom.
Thanks, Kai.
Thanks, Tom. The section on narrow scope maintenance of standards appears sensible. However, it may be useful to add some material on the measures needed to prevent scope creep. Additionally, I'm in broad agreement with the section on revising and developing standards. And I have a quick response to question 3. I'm also in broad agreement with the activities to support implementation of the IAASB standards section. Tom, that's all. Thanks.
Thanks. I think we have one more comment. Eric?
Thanks, Tom. And just echoing others, very supportive of the narrow scope amendments approach, and agree with others that the interpretation approach is not favored from my point of view. The only real question I have is, you know, when it comes to deciding between doing narrow scope amendments versus doing a full scope revision project, it wasn't entirely clear to me how you know, we would compare and contrast those different decisions. Particularly as Sue mentioned the timeline issue, and it would be unfortunate if a narrow scope project gets stuck in a pipeline with a lot of big, more major revisions. So it's just kind of how we decide, you know, when these can take some priority over bigger projects.
Okay. So I hear general support for what the approach is. Some clarification about the distinction between what really is a narrow scope. Like I thought that a little bit we handled that. It's going to be art, but a little bit handled by the fact that we would have some project proposal that would ultimately propose the scope of a narrow scope amendment. But I think we should make sure that we got it thinking right. Maybe Billy will clarify a little bit more on that. And the whole idea of a narrow scope amendment is to be quick. And so Sue's warning to us a little bit about making sure it could be as quick as we can within our current due process as well. But at least I have this conceptual vision in my mind is this would be very much the type of thing we would do is as we start implementing these new standards and people are picking things up, can we go surgically in and do repairs quite quickly with limited, probably using minimum due process requirements, using very little amendment to the standard. Maybe it's a paragraph or 2 that we're changing. Billy, any reaction top of mind?
Thank you, Tom. And again, thank you for all the comments and support. I think, yes, on the distinction between full scope and narrow scope, in my mind, that distinction is also the foundation for that distinction lies in the fact that you still need a project proposal, you still need to scope the project. So for me, it is the outcome of something that is in category C, where you've analyzed it, you've considered what is the possible courses of action, and that will lead to the scoping. I think we also need to see that in the context of the comment that Josephine made earlier, that in theory, you actually always go through A, B, and C, but you can go through A, B, and C in rapid pace. because of urgency, because right there we are, we know what the scope is, we still need to scope it, we still need to get to a project proposal, even for a narrow scope project. And maybe, Bev, I was just thinking we can obviously take this offline, but maybe in category C, when we talk about that the outcome of that is a project proposal, we can sort of say something there about the accommodating both full scope and narrow scope and how that distinction may be drawn. So I think that's a good comment.
Okay. I see no other hands up or reactions, some nodding of heads. So I think we're in a pretty good place on narrow scope amendments and this section. Should we go to the final two questions?
Yes.
Consideration?
Yeah, we can certainly go there. So, so this is going to deal with section 4 of the framework, activities to support implementation of the IAASB standard. So like I said at the beginning, it was clear when we developed the framework that it was really section 1 and section 4 that is something new, something different, something we wanted to give structure to, because it is not part of our normal standard setting activities where clearly we have our due process and working procedures that apply. So in the course of the development of the strategy and work plan back in 2019, at that point, we were also busy with implementation work around ISO 540. And a lot of questions came up. Well, it was the implementation work around ISO 540, and it was also actually the EER project that was really taking off in 2019. And in a few board meetings, questions arose, well, where does this fit in? What do we mean by non-authoritative material? And there was clearly a need that we need to try and describe this a little bit more comprehensively, a need to clarify a little bit about what is in here and what happens to what's in here, but also having the necessary flexibility, again, the point about not getting caught up in our own process. So this is really what section 4 is trying to do. So section 4 looks at activities that are non-authoritative in nature. So the best way to think of this is whatever we do can only fall into one of two buckets. It is either we're busy with something changing our authoritative pronouncements as contemplated in our terms of reference. And in terms of our terms of reference, authoritative pronouncements are our international standards. It's the ISQMs, ISAs, ISAEs, ISREs, and ISRSs. That's our authoritative pronouncements. Anything that's not that is non-authoritative material. But we wanted in the framework for activities to limit it to non-authoritative material, which has the function of supporting implementation of our IAASB international standards. So in section 4, we describe up front what non-authoritative materials are overall, and then we make a distinction between two groups of non-authoritative material: first-time implementation support activities and non-authoritative support materials that we think fulfills the function of supporting the implementation of the IAASB standards. The reason for this distinction is very much brought about by the shift that we also described in our strategy document, of saying that we realize that the IAASB also has a role to play when we put out a new standard to also support the proper implementation and consistent application of that standard. So what you have in Group A is the first-time implementation support activities. And the distinguishing characteristic of what is in this category is that these activities and materials follow immediately after and is intrinsically linked to a standard setting project that has just been completed, where we feel that as the IAASB, we have the greatest value in terms of affecting the implementation in the period immediately after a new or revised standard has been issued. And you will see that we put a timeline on that. We say that would normally be within the period of 6 to 9 months after a standard has been issued. So we then go through who takes responsibility for the actions. Remember, it's a project that has just been completed, so there would be a task force, and that task force, the task force chair together with IAASB staff will proceed to develop a implementation support plan, agreed with the IAASB chair and the technical director, and then the work will mainly be done by staff in coordination with the task force chair, with the flexibility to involve other members of the task force or even the full task force if need be. There may be a need to appoint an implementation working group, as we've seen in a few projects, but that's not a requirement. We can, in the circumstances, decide whether an implementation working group is needed or not. You will then see that the outputs of this is we think that for any standard we do, the first-time implementation support activities will always at least comprise a basis for conclusions document and a general fact sheet. And then, depending on the nature of the project, the issues that came up during the project, the known needs of stakeholders, we can add to that, and there are a number of possibilities that we can add in the form of a first-time implementation guide, other fact sheets, various staff publications, webinars and videos, or focused education sessions and presentations. And then we also set out the development and process for clearance in terms of how this material will then get to a point where it is published. It is set out there on pages 13 and 14. Just the one extra note is that remember the basis for conclusions document does form part of our due process. So in paragraph A44 of our working procedures, it is required that the basis for conclusions document goes to the board for fatal flaw review, and we've just accommodated that. So that's the first time implementation activities in the period immediately after a new or revised standard has been issued. Then there may also be a call on us, or there may be a need for the IAASB to issue non-authoritative support materials. Again, in the context of supporting the proper implementation and consistent application of our standards, where there's a need to address a specific or targeted issue that can even relate to an industry matter or a matter in another type of context, but where there's action needed, but it is clear that we don't need a standard setting response. It is better to address it through either guidance or practical assistance. And in that way, we can then follow this route of non-authoritative support materials. We've highlighted that the need for this can come from various places. It can come obviously from the information gathering and research phase. It can come from an existing project. It can come from outreach activities, targeted requests from stakeholder groups, our ongoing scanning of the environment, etc. The decision to undertake these development activities will principally lie with the technical director with concurrence of the IAASB chair or deputy chair, which also have the discretion, to involve the planning committee, and in certain instances, maybe even the full board. The decision to undertake something also goes together with designating a channel where how this development will take place and how the material will in the end be cleared. So again, there are various items that can, various forms of the material, and that is set out. So that can be anything from an international practice note, non-authoritative guidance document, staff alert, other staff publications, a task force or working group publication, or webinars and videos. Like I said, there has to be a process for developing and clearing these things. And when we originally came up with this idea, even in the document that went to the board in December 2019, there was support for a process that, depending on the topic, depending on the possible impact, distribution, a number of considerations, we may need different levels of involvement from staff, from board members, even expertise in certain instances, and there may be different levels of review or oversight required. And that's where this idea of the channels came up. So really, and I'm not going to go through all of them in detail, the channels are really put in two buckets. So we can undertake the development of non-authoritative materials not involving the full board or involving the full board. If it is not involving the full board, it can be anything from staff-led with some board involvement, or even a working group or task force. And this really applies to anything except for practice notes and non-authoritative guidance documents. Non-authoritative guidance documents and international practice notes have to involve the full board. So in terms of involving the full board, there are two options. We can either go through a process of a negative clearance mechanism, where and that's, for example, what we're going to do on the ER assurance, project with what we seen as the supplemental documents, those documents that will accompany the main guidance document. That will be channel 5, and that, in essence, what we will do, it is developed and it is then circulated to the board for no objection to be published. If there are objections, the task force and staff have to deal with those objections, and the task force chair needs to finally recommend the document for publication, including why they are satisfied that the objections have been satisfactorily dealt with. Or channel 6. Channel 6 must apply to international practice notes, can also apply to anything else that is designated to channel 6. And that is really where it's not due process, because there's no due process requirement, but we borrow from due process and say it goes through our normal board process of deliberating issues, progressing a project, and finally approval by the board, as we are going to do with the non-authoritative guidance document on ER assurance at the March meeting. And there's also, finally, we did also include a list of considerations that may assist in deciding which of these channels or these two buckets are most appropriate for a particular piece of non-authoritative material. So, Tom, that's the end of section 4. And as you've indicated, there are two questions. The one relates specifically to any views on this section 4, and then just an overall question looking back at all 4 sections, if there's anything else that we need to consider in finalizing the framework.
Thank you, Billy. And I think we got a lot of general comments in the first go, but again, let's open as question 4. So we'll take comments on questions 3 and 4. Any initial reactions? Edo.
Yes, thank you, Tom. And thank you, Willy, for your explanation around the topics. I think it's these channels. I also see in the context of the funnel, as Wendy called it, of how projects flow and what the output would be. So whether a topic goes from A to B, C towards non-authoritative guidance or any other type of output, it will get some board visibility. That being the case, I'm wondering to what extent we really need 6 channels, and aren't we overcomplicating it? The channels seem to intermingle who does what and who approves what, creating maybe a level of complexity that is not needed. Is it really that important that we need to separate the channel for who has it prepared? Question mark. I also am thinking of, I guess, for the due process of the various outputs of the board or of the IAASB. And mind you, we do, by definition, name it non-authoritative. That doesn't mean it doesn't carry any authority. And there is some care in the outputs that goes under the name of the IAASB. And in that sense, I'm also minded that well, I'm comforted that the various topics, before they enter into non-authoritative material, go through a level of oversight by the board through this process A, B, C, etc. But it also, if you just look at the channels itself and the material, you could be in a situation where either somebody in a working group or a board member has a specific desire to push for something and something gets developed, and where other than the chair and the director, this could flow through. I wonder whether that is what we want. And I'll leave that for you to think about. On channel 5, negative clearance by the board, well, I've just recently been privy to it myself, and I was wondering to what extent there needs to be some level of transparency about what the other board members' feedback was before something goes out. Well, is it appropriately considered, or maybe it triggers some thoughts with other board members? And then I was a bit concerned when reading it, just in it by itself on page 14, in respect of the first time implementation, that's ordinary period of 6 to 9 months. For certain elements of that output, that seems late. There are firms and practitioners that need to revise their methodologies, and I think you probably mean up to 6 or 9 months. And there's a spectrum, of course. A webinar, etc., could be a little bit later after people have digested it, while certain other material would be much sooner. And maybe there's an element that you can work in to make that, bring that point across. That's all I had, Tom. Thank you very much. And I think with all the other comments made, there's nothing else for consideration in finalizing the framework.
Okay. Supportive of the direction. Questions about simplification, if possible. Josephine.
Thanks, Tom. Yes, I have just one point, which is similar to Ado's point and akin with Roger's caution about not overcomplicating things, particularly in the channels. And I'm saying that in the context of the work that we looked at before. So, for example, I was thinking about EER, and essentially, notwithstanding, it said Channel 6 may apply to a non-authoritative, but it does imply that EER would have gone through a Channel 5 process, which I think, considering how complex that guidance is, that wouldn't really be appropriate. So maybe a little bit more flexibility about the fact that you might actually need to put non-authoritative guidance through the Channel 6 as well, and maybe some transparency about when that would happen. On the whole, though, I'm happy with what you've got. Just maybe have another look at the complexity around those channels. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Josephine. Kai Morton.
Thank you. Yeah, I really much follow the same comments as Ido and Josephine so far. The direction of what we're doing here is good. I think, though, that as others have explained, I wonder if we're overcomplicating and going into too much detail on what we're doing here. If you also look at the document overall, it's 20 pages and 10 of them is describing this process. So it's we're going into quite a lot of detail, and I think, as I said, it may be overcomplicating something that not necessarily is needed. So supportive of what's here, but if simplify if we can. I don't think we need to go into this level of detail for all of that.
I love simplicity, but Billy, you have to remind me, if I remember this, is we started off with 3 channels and we got a lot of complaints from board members about what ifs and in this case, and I'm not comfortable with this. So hence the six channels. This is how principle-based standard setting becomes rule-based pretty quickly. Is that correct, Billy? I remember we were at 3.
Yeah, it was a, it was the result of a lot of input, and like you said, that and especially as we went through things like the EER project, the implementation guidance for 540, etc. A lot of these questions came up, and people wanted certainty around. But what if this, and what if we? What if there's a work group? And in the end, that's actually why we bucketed them into just 2 buckets. And so there's one where there's not full board involvement, and there's a group of full board involvement. But we can certainly look if the board is comfortable that we can simplify it within those 2 buckets. That's possibly something we can look at, because for me, that's how I think about it. I'm thinking about this non-authoritative material like a staff alert, where you will not require the full board's involvement, and there will be certain things there where you require the full board's involvement, whether that is through a positive process of board deliberation and approval, or the negative clearance process. So I'm happy for us to go back and have a look at it.
Thank you. Okay, Eric.
Thanks, Tom. And I won't pile on with the channels discussion. I did want to focus in on the first-time implementation aspect. As the document recognizes, the IAASB has a responsibility to help with facilitating the changes. And it just worries me that once the standard is approved and we start into the first time implementation aspects, it really goes offline from the board at that point, and we lose sight of really what's being developed, why it's being developed, what issues it's focusing in on, and the timing. Edo has mentioned the timing of 6 to 9 months and concerns around that. I mean, it seemed to me that the board, there should be more board involvement in, planning out or supporting the plan that's developed by the task force for the first time implementation guidance, because a lot of national standard setters are relying on the IAASB following through on those first time implementation papers and building on them in their own work. So I think from my point of view, there needs to be a bit more process, at least, agreeing on the plan of attack, what specifically is going to be done, and providing input on that process. Thank you.
Okay, Diane.
I won't take much time. I mean, I echo the comments on the channels. Obviously, Ada made a great point. Just because it's non-authoritative, if it's going out under the IAASB letterhead, it is important. And I'm all for transparency across the board, so we know what's going out to the public. When you think about the channels, maybe just think the 80-20 rule. You're never going to make everybody happy. What are 80% of the times? What are the 80% nature of the topics that you're issuing? What would be appropriate protocols for those types of situations? And try and not maybe boil the ocean. I am a little concerned that the channels are overly complicated, and maybe there's a way we can simplify that. But overall, I think you're absolutely moving in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you. Sue?
Thanks. Point on the channel piece. It's to do with the negative clearance, and it was really just a word of caution around. There's a note about dealing with objections, and I'm always just a bit wary about that, because by dealing with one objection, it may undermine the silent agreements that you've got from others. So, and I'm not quite sure how we deal with that in that kind of negative situation. So, Edo's comment about transparency of those would be helpful. And I wanted to add my support to the implementation support material. I think that's an important part of the process. I think the webcasts have received positive feedback. It adds some colour, but I had the same comment as Edo about the timing, 6 to 9 months after the standard for people who've got to develop methodologies and implement is quite a long delay. Thank you.
Thank you. Roger?
Yeah, the only comment I got on the document, Villy, and then I've got a couple of observations, is I probably saw the basis for conclusions as a due process step. So I think of it more as a due process step rather than a first-time implementation step. So it's a matter of how we categorise that. So in that regard. Let me support Eric very much on, I think there needs to be accountability back. When we take a vote, we vote on the expectation that there will be undertaken activities outside. And so I think there needs to be a report back as to how those activities are progressing. We need to make sure that we've got staff time and board time to progress those activities. So I'd be very supportive of a greater accountability on those particular areas, just to make sure that we are delivering what we say we're delivering. I agree with the channels too. Villy, I've been in a conversation with you where you've been arguing whether it's Channel 5 or Channel 6, and I had no idea what you were talking about. If it had been negative clearance versus positive clearance, I would have understood. But you know, so again, a simplification there would be very beneficial. Thank you.
Thank you. Fernando.
Thanks, Tom. I also echo comments from others, very much in favor of simplification. But in reality, if we end up having a framework with 5 channels or 100, I don't care. This is something that I don't really need to know by heart. Someone will tell me how the process for approval is going to be, and that's all I need to know. So I wouldn't really mind how many channels we have. It's up to probably the process of being transparent, and that's all that we need to care about. Thanks.
Thank you. Lynn?
Thank you, Tom. I just wanted to come in on the channels because I'm, as a board member and a task force chair, I've used them for EER, for the papers you're going to see in March. And to me, a framework is only as good as whether it's workable. Can you use it and does it make sense? And certainly the conversation that Billy and I had, we very quickly came to the conclusion that the guidance was Channel 6 and the supplements were, as Billy said, Channel 5. And it just worked easily. So I don't think we should get too hung up on how many channels there are or whatever. To me, if it works, let's go with it. We can always change it sometime in the future, but certainly it's practical and usable at this point in time. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you. Okay. I need a key for the channels too from time to time, but the big thing is the 2 categories. So Billy, back to you.
Thank you, Tom. Just maybe picking up on a few things. We will certainly go back and just look at the channels. Lynn, thank you for your comment at the end as well. We've actually had a test run now of it on the EER side. I think there's probably a middle ground there that we can find, a happy place that I hope we can find. There were a few comments around some concerns that it seems as if some of the stuff goes offline and then the board is not involved, which is clearly so. Like I said, there are some things that will not involve the full board. And that was really about creating a mechanism for making sure that we have flexibility and be able to respond quickly to certain things. Like, for example, the COVID-19 staff alerts last year. I mean, those didn't go through the full board, but they all went through what we now have there as Channel 2. So in each of those, it was staff together with 2, 3, 4 board members that looked at those papers. If we go to a situation of bringing everything back to the board, that will obviously very much slow down the whole process. And I think that's why we've got those considerations in terms of deciding when does something need to be looked at by the full board, and when is it fine that it doesn't have to go to the full board. We can certainly apply our minds to that again. It's clear that a few people did raise that as a concern. Just on the first-time implementation support activities, the first point I wanted to make, it's in the issues paper and in the document itself. What we are also trying to do with this section 4, both in terms of the first-time implementation support activities and the non-authoritative materials, is also to put this under the IAASB's control, because there's also boundaries around what we can do and what we have time and capacity for. And so it is clear that when a new standard is issued, there would be first-time implementation support activities that we can issue, but we will certainly, as always, look to others like IFAC, national standard setters, professional accountancy organizations, to also play a role in the adoption and implementation of the standards through issuing guidance and materials on a more ongoing basis. And I think that's always been the case. But you're quite right. I think a few people, Ido, Eric raised the point about the time. Sue also raised that point. What in there is a maximum of 6 to 9. It's up to 6 to 9 months. And the idea is really to put an implementation plan together that sort of staggers the deliverables over a period. So I hope that clarifies that point. In terms of on Eric's point around that, I know, and Bev, you can maybe just remind me of this. I know that the implementation plan for 315 was actually, you gave that to the board when we actually approved this standard. I think it was part of the materials. So I think we just need to make a distinction between, it's fine, we can show the implementation plan to the board, but when the actual development material, when the actual work takes place, again, if there's going to be a need to bring all of that back to the board, that's going to significantly slow down the process. But I understand the point that there needs to be some type of accountability, so we can just go back and have a look at that. I think, Tom, that's everything that I had that I just wanted to respond to quickly. Thanks.
Okay. Any reactions based upon Billy's comments? Eric?
Sorry, Tom, I just wanted to be clear on the first time implementation guidance. I was not suggesting that it all come back to the board for review and approval. I was just think that the plan should be discussed or made available to the board, and then as Roger said, some accountability for getting it done on time. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, because that's actually how I understood the comment. So thank you. That clarifies it. Thanks.
Okay, Lynn.
I just want to strongly reinforce that there should be things that the staff have responsibility for and accountability for that don't need to come to the board. We have intelligent and committed staff who can do the job perfectly well, and I wouldn't like any sense being left out of this meeting that everything must come to the board. So I just wanted to put that on the record. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you. Okay. My read from this is there are a number of refinements that we should consider to either simplify, enhance the document, but in general, the board is supportive with the approach and the broad thrust of the statement of activity, framework for activities. Before I sort of bring it to conclusion, I just wanted to ask if Karen or Jim wanted to comment from their perspective.
Thanks, Tom. Is this just comments on this section or the whole overall agenda topic? The
whole agenda topic before we reach any conclusion.
Okay. Yeah, okay. From my perspective, I wanted to say that I think the framework is a great step forward. I think this is, as you have communicated, this is going to serve to bring transparency, which always serves the public interest. And I agree with the comments that were made earlier that this framework would have helped a lot when you were dealing with the topics of going concern and fraud. On how these could have escalated quickly and changed priority on your work. And I think the PIOB really appreciates the fact that consideration of the public interest in terms of setting prioritization is included in, and I think we find that that's a very helpful way to determine whether a project should move through the categories into a work effort and project. So thank you very much for the effort for the framework.
Thank you. And one of the things I should say is that even though this is the first time we're getting to sort of approval on the board, we've sort of been running with the framework in the background for the last 12 months or so or more, just to help us organize our thoughts. And hence you've seen some prioritization of projects as a result. Jim.
Thanks, Tom. I'm also supportive of the framework, and to have the framework. I think my one comment, it does seem like more of an, I won't say back office, but an operational procedures, more so than what the board might deal with on a day-to-day basis. And my general thought is there's an awful lot with the category and then the various channels. But if that's helpful, and I was glad to hear from Lynn that did work in the work she's doing. The one comment I might have is there is reference to non-authoritative guidance, and this might be a comment a little bit out of left field, but for the non-authoritative guidance, I do think there are a lot of opportunities to expand in that area, and particularly as we get pushback from the volume of the standards, size and complexity. I think more and more could be put in this non-authoritative guidance area. So hopefully this will provide an opportunity to expand that particular area. Thanks.
Thanks. There's always a caution. I get the point, Jim, but there's a caution to put it at too much non-authoritative guidance, because I think someone made the point earlier that anything we put out, even despite us calling non-authoritative, has some authority in the perception of people, and adds to sort of the quote literature unquote on the topic. So, it's a balancing act I think we'll have to face. Billy and Bev, any concluding remarks before I try to bring all of this together?
Tom, I just wanted to again, thank you for the input. There's obviously some refinement required. So if I may, Tommy, I want to propose a negative clearance by the board. So if the board is happy to just say that they agree that we can proceed to finalize the framework for activities and adopt it as part of our internal process, what we will do is, I think there's quite a few things. So we will, at staff level, take it back, and then we will clear it with the planning committee, just to see if the board is comfortable with that.
Yeah, that's what I was proposed earlier, and what I think makes the most sense here. Does anyone object to that proposal? Okay, Lily and Bev, great work. Planning committee, thanks very much for your input throughout the process. Board, great input in this discussion too. This will not be the final version of the framework for activities. As I said, I think this very much is a living document. What I propose at 7:55 a.m. here, take a 10-minute break, and then we'll turn to agenda item 2 afterwards. Does that sound good? I think people need a break. So see you in 10 minutes. Okay, we're going to start in a minute. Okay, could everyone turn the cameras back on and rejoin the meeting? Great, let's get going. So feels like we just developed our work plan, but we're going to be talking about developing a work plan again. And let me, by making that sort of joke, it's not really the time to question the process in terms of the time scale here. We are with this reality right now. We developed a 2-year work plan and we're in a strategy cycle. So the time frame is very much dictated by that. The idea today is to get input from you, the board, on our approach for dealing with that reality over the following 2 years. And the team has put forward a proposed approach that the planning committee has already reviewed for board consideration and comment. So Bev, I'm going to turn it over to you to explain what we've put together and answer comments, but hopefully we'll be in a good place at the end to adopt an approach. And again, if we want to change the time period for work plan consultations in the future, that's a different conversation than the one we're having now, which I think is a valid conversation to have at some point.
Okay, Tom, I think I'll start. So as I said at the beginning, today is my and Bev's chance to dominate the meeting. So you're gonna be stuck for us on agenda item 2 as well. So working group, agenda item 2, development of the work plan. So again, just looking for the board's input and agreement on the approach that we want to adopt in developing the work plan for 2022-2023. So as you will remember, when we approved the strategy at the end of 2019, that was the strategy for a 4-year period, 2022 to 2023, but the work plan was only for 2020 to 2021. So this is now filling in that gap to cover the 2022-2023 period. And this is dictated by due process. So in terms of our due process, and we put an extract of the relevant paragraphs out of the due process in appendix 1 of agenda item 2, we need to consult on the work plan. That includes a public consultation with the CAG, as well as the PIOB's oversight over the development of the work plan. So when we started to look at this, obviously our starting point is what's on our work plan at the moment, and as we've indicated in the paper, we very regularly look at the forward plan, at least after each board meeting. Last year we probably did it a few more times because of the volatile environment that we were in terms of the changing things changing rapidly. And in that same way, we had occasion at the November planning committee meeting to discuss comprehensively with the planning committee the forward plan for 2021 and 2022 at that stage. So in that way, we always look about 18 to 24 months ahead. I just want to, at this point, also just alert the board to the fact that off the back of that discussion at the planning committee in November, as well as the outcome of the board discussions on various projects in December, we did actually publish an updated detailed work plan table on the IAASB website last week, Monday. So that is available under the projects and the work plan tab. You will find the updated work plan. That only covers 2021 because obviously we need to consult on 2022 and 2023. So you will see what we've set out in the paper is that clearly at the beginning, at the start of 2022, there's a number of significant projects that would still be underway, and we've set that out. That's obviously also in the context of a few assumptions around the normal progression of a project, continuing changing circumstances within the COVID-19 environment. You know, when we did that forward plan with the planning committee in November, we worked on an assumption that everything for the first half of this year will be virtual, and we might be returning to some physical interaction in Q3 and Q4. Now, already thinking about physical meetings in Q3, some people think that is already being very optimistic for this year. So again, these things are subject to change. And then obviously the other big assumption that we make is that around our thinking around all these things are based on current capacity of the board, which obviously is limited in a virtual environment, and also capacity of staff. Taking all of that into account, we did come to a conclusion that there is very little additional capacity to start any new substantial projects, probably until somewhere in 2023, where there might be some time opening up for one, at the most two new projects, as we've set it out in the issues paper. So the planning committee was of the view that the strategic objectives and strategic actions in our strategy for 2022 to 2023 remains intact, remains relevant for this period to see us through to the end of 2023. And that obviously there needs to be a priority given to the projects that are already in process at the beginning of 2022. So the decision was that we want to propose an approach where we do the consultation in a way that is takes account of the limitations we're working in terms of the projects that we already have ongoing, but also make sure that we do get meaningful input from our stakeholders that can actually guide us with certain decisions going forward. And we were in the same position back in 2017, 2018 as well. I see now that our issues paper refers to it as 2108, but that's clearly a mistake. So back in 2017, 2018. So I think at this point, I'm going to stop and I'm going to hand over to Bev that will then take you through the approach that we're suggesting. And I think we've got one or two slides to share as well. Thank you, Bev.
Thanks very much, Billy. So I think, as Billy said, at the start of 2017, we were in the same position. At that point in time, we had the big foundational projects underway. There was 540, 315, all the quality management, ISO 600 was going at that point. So we had a very full agenda. But again, as noted, we because of due process, we have to consult. So we did sort of a very light touch survey, and we're proposing the same thing. We're a little bit in the same position where we've got some big projects that we've started. We should finish those and we can ask some questions around that. So we're sort of taking the same approach. I do have a slide that I wanted to share before I carry on. So Michelle, if you can put up the first slide, please. So what this shows is a little bit of the flow of the projects from 2021 into 2022. I haven't got 2023 in there. You start moving into an area of uncertainty, but we do planning all the way into 2023, sort of a rough estimate at this point in time. Again, I don't have everything on here. What is on here, what we call our more substantial projects. So these are the ones that really take the board time. Not so much a staff issue because there's a lot of other things that get done by the staff that are not in here. So this really just reflects sort of the touch points with the board and what's going on. So if you have a look at this at the start of 2021, so this quarter, we have 4, and that dark green color is meant to show substantial time and effort. So in quarter 1, we have 4 substantial projects, which are really at a sort of a really big point. So ISO 600, we've got the LCE projects, we've got audit evidence, which is really picked up, and we're finishing the EER. So it sort of shows that we have generally 4 to 5 big substantial topics at any point in time. Then we have a number of others, which are sort of that lighter green. And then we have lots of things which aren't shown on here, which are the much lighter green. So we always doing work on technology, IAASB, the post-implementation reviews, implementation activities. There's a lot going on in the background. It doesn't necessarily come to the board. There's information gathering on new topics that's happening. We're always doing work on the strategy and work plan. And then there's a number of other initiatives that come to the board. So this is not the full picture, but it's the sort of big things. So as I said, at the beginning of 2021 in Q1, you've got 4 big ones. At the end of 2021, we expect to have still 4 big ones on the agenda, although we expect ISO 600 to be finishing at that point in time. Audit evidence will still be going, the LCE will still be going, it'll just be out for consultation hopefully at that point. The fraud and going concern again are much more substantial at that point. And then we move into Q1 of 2022. And we sort of move forward in 2022 with the 4 big ones being the LCE, the audit evidence, the fraud and going concern. There may be some potential for some others, things like CUSP. We don't know where that's going to go and what that's going to be. The IAASB PI project may turn into something a little bit bigger, the auditor reporting up. From looking at the papers for tomorrow, not sure there'll be anything, but there's lots of sort of smaller things. But the 4 big ones, which take up a majority of the board time in 2022. So there's very little time to start new projects. And this is where we are. And it's based on sort of how we see projects flowing. It's obviously targeted timelines. As Willie said, we're assuming we're going back to face-to-face meetings and not virtual. This may very well change if September and December move into a virtual environment, because we just have much less time at the board meetings. So that's sort of where we are. And then obviously, if you just sort of see forward, I haven't got it on the slide, but into 2023, hopefully LCEs are finished, but it may re-expose, in which case that'll go well into 2023. Audit evidence will just have come back, so that'll be a substantial project in 2023. Fraud will be out on exposure, but come back, and so same with going concern. So there'll be lots of work on those 2 topics. So there may or may not be time in 2023. We expect at least 1 project, so hopefully LCEs are finished at some point. Time will open up for the board capacity for another substantial project. So that's how we sort of foresee the 1 or 2 projects in 2023 that will start. Because I think people automatically, you think, well, 600's ending at the end of 2021. Why don't we start new big projects? But the idea is that we've already got going concern and fraud that will sort of take their capacity. So those have been sort of the B and C information gathering, less time at the board. As they become bigger projects and more substantial, they take the time that 600 is giving up. So you sort of got this sort of workflow of the projects coming in. So I just wanted to share that so that there's a little bit of understanding about where we are for 2022 and 2023 and why we're taking the approach that we are. We will need to explain this to our stakeholders so that they understand that there's not a lot of capacity for a lot of new work. And obviously we want to leave space if something urgent comes up and we do need to do something. There may be a limited scope amendment that needs to be done, or there may be something else that will take both staff and board capacity. So in that context, we plan to do a survey. We'll explain all of this in the survey, and it's got it in the paper. We can ask a couple of questions. We'll just confirm our strategic objectives. There's nothing to indicate that they've changed, but probably good to just do a check-in with our stakeholders that it is all right. We'll confirm that these are the projects that our stakeholders are happy we finish these projects, because we can make time by stopping something here or slowing it down. But we never really hear about people asking us to slow things down. It's more speed it up. So we will just ask a question about whether they're happy that we finish these, and sort of that plan that we have for 2022 still seems reasonable. And then as we go into 2022, 2023, we will have some capacity. Remembering that this shows the board capacity, not necessarily staff capacity. So what will happen in the background, likely towards the end of 2022, more towards the beginning of 2023, staff will start to work on the next topic that will be coming to the board, because by the time it comes to the board, you're probably sitting in the end of category B, category C sort of information gathering. There's already a lot of work that's been done on that topic. So there is work being done in the background on the new topics. But we've got a couple of topics that have really bubbled up, and I think we need probably a ranking from our stakeholders as to which one should be next. I'll just use two very obvious ones. So 330, IAASB 2410, both of those definitely need some work. We know that. They would likely be the next one, but let's hear from our stakeholders whether they agree. There's also a bunch of other topics. So what we were thinking is to sort of give maybe 8 to 10 topics that we really see as being possible topics, and asking our stakeholders to rank that, and that will help us. So we'll apply the criteria, and then we'll look at the ranking that the stakeholders have given us as to sort of helping us in, or informing us as we make decisions as to the next topics that get done. Then I think on timing, with regard to the actual survey itself, it's set out in the agenda paper. So I think the next thing that you would expect to see is a draft of the survey, sort of just explaining where we are to the stakeholders, and then having the questions in there. Again, there would be some supporting papers to explain how we've got to the 8 to 10 topics, so that the board understands what that is. But we, again, trying to keep this a little bit light touch. There is some stakeholder fatigue around how much we're asking of them. So again, also just taking that into account and what we actually need to get out of this, to sort of keep it at a slightly higher level, but still to get valuable information for ourselves if we are consulting on this. So you'll see a draft of the survey, clear it by email, and hopefully we'll get the survey out around April time, and that will sort of enable the rest of the timing that we've got set out, because we do need to complete this or approve it, the work plan for 2022-2023 in December at the latest, obviously, because we go into the new work plan period after that. So just very briefly, that was just describing sort of where we are, how we've got to the conclusions we've got to, and our approach. So if I can have the next slide, please. So I think with that, we'll just move into the questions, and we'll take all of the questions together. So really just asking, are you okay with the approach? In particular, a short survey, and are you okay that you clear this by email? Whether the questions we're going to ask are appropriate, or is there something else we should be asking while we develop the survey? And then whether you think the timeline appears reasonable, including a 90-day consultation period. We've given 90 days because it's just meant to be a light touch sort of consultation. We generally do our consultations for the work plan on a 90-day cycle, but if you think we need longer, then again, just to flag that with us. And then whether there's anything else that we need to be thinking about as we move forward in developing the work plan for the next period. So with that, Tom, I will hand back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Bev. Okay, comments on the presentation and the questions 1 and 2 on the screen right now? Fernando.
Thanks, Tom. Just want to express that I'm comfortable with the proposed timetable. Also, they have a short survey and the 90 days consultation period. I think that by the time it will be issued, we are outside business season. There's some holidays probably in between, but I think it makes sense for firms and stakeholders to provide comments. The question I have is if there's anything on the list of items in category B that probably needs to be considered for escalation to C, and it's outside the projects that we saw on the previous slide. I'm just curious because I can't remember what we have on that list, and if there's any expectation that maybe once the survey is going out, those items will be coming as comments being very relevant for stakeholders. Thanks.
Okay, Taylor.
Tom, thanks. Some brief comments. First of all, I'm in favor of the proposed approach to the consultation, including a short survey. I also agree that the question of the survey should reflect the process as set forth in the framework of activities. I also believe the timeline, including the 90-day consultation period, is reasonable. And my comment or reaction to the second question is simply no. Thanks.
Thank you for that clear guidance. Next, we have Sachika.
Thank you, Tom. I also support the proposed approach. One thing I would like to comment is that similar to my view on the framework, I also think that it's very important that interconnectivity between the survey and the framework and the result of the survey, including the reason behind the relevant decision, are made very transparent. But I really support the proposal in total. Thank you.
Thank you. Chun-Li.
Thank you, Tom. So I'm also very supportive of this light touch consultation approach through the survey. And the only point I want to raise is on paragraph 12, on the second bullet on the preferred order of the future possible projects. I support that as well. I just wasn't very clear, and maybe this was a little bit of what Fernando has asked as well. What are we going to put up there for the respondent to rank? Are we going to put in even those that are already in progress, for example, those on fraud and going concern? We are convinced that those are very important based on what we have heard. But if we don't put it out there, we might not know. There might be some topics that come out ahead, and we might need to deprioritize some of the work here and prioritize some of the other work. I guess my point is we don't know. So it might be worth doing that. And we also need to be clear about the legitimacy of what the survey is going to tell us about the preferred order, and indeed, the work streams and the projects identified, because it's dependent on the robustness of the responses we manage to attract. And as always, I'm sure we will emphasize the importance of us hearing from a wide range of stakeholders. But the reality is that we will get more responses from the SSBs, from the PAOs, from the larger networks and firms, and even regulators. And we need to consider supplementary, I think, engagement efforts to get feedback from others and to accord the appropriate weightage to their views, even if they are not as strongly represented in terms of numbers. So that will be my only, I guess, addition to our consideration. Thanks, Tom.
Okay, Eric.
Thanks, Tom. And just want to indicate my support under question 1 to the approach and the survey and so forth. I agree with what's being proposed here. Makes so much sense. On question 2, really just a couple of things to consider. We had the presentation on the disruptive technology recently. May not be a specific project coming out of that, but I think a question would be to get some feedback on how much effort does the board need to spend in discussing this topic going forward. I'm not sure how to exactly word that, but I think that's going to be an ongoing topic, I would have thought. And the second thing I would suggest considering is just what are the next steps for EER, given all of the recent developments, and whether and how the IAASB might keep pace with those developments. Just a couple of thoughts for your consideration. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Eric. Kai Morton.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Beth and Willie, for the presentation here. I just want to come in and say that I support what's being proposed, and I think what is presented here looks very reasonable, and I think it's a good process that are being suggested. And I think similar to the others, some clarity around what people will come in and rank would be good. It's not easy to read that out of these papers, but that's probably not the purpose either. So thank you.
Thank you. Sue.
Thank you. I also support the use of the survey and the process you've outlined for approval and the consultation period and so on. I thought Bev's explanation of that graph was helpful in that it was focusing on board time as opposed to staff time, because I think there are things like ISQM1 implementation and other stuff like that that will be happening that people may question as well. So maybe we can think about making sure that that's clear. And I also like Chun-Wee's suggestion about including fraud and going concern, because there is a bit of an assumption that those are going to move through the process, but it's a good opportunity perhaps to just test that out as well. Thanks.
Thank you. Roger.
Very supportive of the approach. Short survey. It's going to depend a little bit on what the 8 to 10 items are that you put on this list. So I'll be very interested to see those, Bev. And I know you'll include something else which says others, but the 8 to 10 will have a natural advantage over the others. There may be an ability to ask if there are any narrow scope amendments that people can see, so that we can get people thinking about those types of areas. But that's asking a little bit more. Happy with the time frame, and also happy to explore potential future of EER to what do we do after the guidance. There's a lot of other specific topics that could be potentially explored. So supportive of considering something there. And I would be supportive of including fraud and going concern on the list of 8 to 10. But again, we are already committed into that, so that's a recognition. So thank you.
Okay. I think we got strong support for the proposed approach. Some encouragement to make sure that we reach out just to, as you know, to a broad stakeholder group. As you know, we don't count the votes when it comes to comments or comment letters or surveys in a pure form. We do count them, but we take everything in terms of the substantive arguments and the diversity of input as well. Bev, any reactions to the comments that were made?
Yeah, just a couple. Just on fraud and going concern. So there are projects. So there are projects that have been agreed by the board for now. We're moving through the process. Obviously, as we move to project proposal, there'll be much more board involvement. So I would see those in category C. I think and those would be covered in the survey by saying these are the projects we've got underway. Are you happy that we continue with those? So they would come up in that aspect. What we're really looking for in the 8 to 10 are the new topics. So what is our next project or two that's going to come onto the board's agenda? And I think we need to do some work. So we've got category A. It's a little bit messy at the moment. We've got this big spreadsheet with lots of topics. We just need to sort of work through it. We need to do a bit of a scan. So sitting on there, and there's a number of topics that could come up. As I said, ISA 330. We got lots of comments in when we were doing ISA 315. There's been some other things that are driving 330. Probably does need a revision. We've got ISRE 2410, which is the reviews, which hasn't actually even been clarified. And there's some real reporting issues in that, which have really been exacerbated by the COVID environment. So we really do need to look at that. I wrote down a couple of other topics that I thought. So there's ones like 620 experts. We always hear that we need to do some work in that area. We need to obviously look at technology. So some of you made some comments, so we would need to sort of have that as one of the categories as to what comes next. Assurance on non-financial information. We're very aware that there's a lot happening in that space. We do need to do some sort of concerted effort as to understand what that is and whether there's anything more that's needed. But again, that would come in line with the other things. Does it take the place of 330 or 2410? There's XBRL that sort of keeps popping up. Joint audits, you sort of hear a little bit more noise around. So what we need to do is we need to look at everything that's sitting in category A and try and find those topics, sort of the 8 to 10 that we will have in there. And then there will be a question on to the stakeholders on whether there's anything else that are more important than those 8 to 10, and what those topics are and why they're more important than the 8 to 10. I think if we provided the whole of category A, it'll just be a little bit overwhelming because there's a real lot in there. So we've got to do a little bit of a filtering exercise to get to the 8 to 10 that in our view are probably the most likely next projects. And the ranking really, and we can make this clear, it'll just help inform the board. So it's not to say that the ranking's a counting exercise, and if more people pick this one, then we're going to do it over another one. It will just help that when we get to the point that we've put things through criteria and we have, say, 2 or 3 projects that we need to select from, then that ranking will help inform us as to what the stakeholders are looking for as well. And then I got Chanwee's point about we probably need to also just think about how we get the survey out to people who we don't ordinarily hear from. If it's meant to be a light touch survey, we can work with IFAC and see how they can maybe help with getting the survey out to hear from others that we don't ordinarily hear from. And I think, let me just see if there was anything else. No, I think that was sort of all the questions. I think thank you for the input. If anyone has any editorials, both on the framework and the this part, then if they can just let us know if there's anything sort of smaller that wasn't brought up at the board meeting. But I think, Tom, I'll come back to you now. Thanks.
I see Jim's hand is raised.
Thanks, Tom. And just one general comment, and from a CAG perspective, I think, and it relates, I was looking at in the next agenda item, there was a survey, and I just want to be sure when you do this survey that, or in the future when you do this survey, that you have good representation from public sector, because I think at least in the next agenda item, I don't see that public sector representation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Okay, I think we got support for that, for the approach for the work plan for 2022 and 2023, as laid out by the staff. Karen, Jim, if you wanted to add more general comments, any observations on that? I think, Jim, you probably, my read was from your comment was they supportive, but don't forget the public sector on a survey.
Yes, I would say from a CAG perspective, we are supportive of the approach here. Thanks.
Right. Karen?
Thanks, Tom. I think it's very well laid out in the work plan. You're right that there are a lot of things on the plate, and it would be good to do a quick survey to ensure you understand the ranking of the constituents, and from the PIOB's perspective, that serves the public interest. So thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I propose that we start to bring the meeting to a close. We are reconvening tomorrow afternoon, my time. Sorry, it'll be late for those in Europe and in South Africa. I apologize for that, but this is our share the pain board times moment. But tomorrow we're going to be talking about auditor reporting and post-implementation review. Really interesting paper, and it's our first real opportunity to discuss what next to do with that and what our approach will be to the survey results and the research findings. So look forward to that discussion tomorrow. Thank you very much for the discussion today. I think it puts us on a good path on both the framework for activities and our work plan consultation. So I'll bring it to a close. Thank you for all those who are following us on YouTube too. Thanks for your interest, and we'll see you tomorrow. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.